Welcome to BIV Today, the podcast from the newsroom of Business in Vancouver. I'm Kirk Lapointe, publisher and editor-in-chief. Increasingly, our economy is striving to be circular, to keep materials, components, products, and assets at their highest utility and value at all times, and for a long time. This is different than the take, make, use, dispose linear model of production and consumption. Nowhere is this more evident than in our forestry and construction industries. We're going to explore this circular economy and its opportunities over two parts, today and tomorrow, with Paul Shorthouse, the Senior Director of Delphi.ca, one of the leading consultancies in the circular economy in Canada. Today, we're going to have a look at how the circular economy works, and tomorrow at the opportunities for British Columbia and Canada. Our series is sponsored by naturallywood.com. Paul, thanks a lot for joining us.
Yes, good morning.
Well, let's go slowly here at first, Paul, and walk us through the meaning of a circular economy. What does it mean?
Yeah, thanks, Kirk. You touched on it briefly there in your introduction. As you mentioned, circular economy really aims to keep materials and components and products and assets at their highest utility and value at all times. And as you mentioned, the sort of traditional linear model where you take it, extract resources and you turn them into something useful and you use them for a while, and then at the end of the life you kind of forget about them and dispose of them, puts a lot of pressure on our ecosystems, on our environment, but it also is a huge lost economic opportunity in terms of the value of those materials and resources that end up being lost from use from our economy. So circular economy is really rethinking the way we traditionally done things. It rethinks supply chains, it rethinks products. It basically looks at the redesign of products and services to be more durable, to last longer, to allow them to be repaired or refurbished, for buildings, for example, to be disassembled at end of life and get those materials back, eliminate toxins and pollution from that process and regenerate natural systems in the process of doing that. So it's a systems thinking approach. It's been around for a long time. We just haven't been calling it that so much in North America, until recently, where the term circular economy has come to the forefront. But Europe and China and other countries have been embracing circular economy for a couple of decades. And really it brings together a number of principles like around sustainable development and industrial ecology and design for environment and cradle to cradle thinking, things that we've talked about, but under sort of a comprehensive umbrella.
So that's a great framework to start us off on this one. But then let's focus first off on what the main problems the circular economy is trying to solve. What would you say they are?
Yeah, I mean, there's three crises right now that we're facing, and we're feeling some of that right now in BC with all the wildfire smokes. One is climate change and the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions in our environment impacting on our natural ecosystems. The second is biodiversity and ecosystem loss. And impacts, and the third one is pollution. So you think of plastics and other items that enter our environment. So circular economy is designed to really tackle those three critical crises. But if you look at it at a sort of sector level, when you're, say, for example, in the construction and forestry and built environment space, in Canada, construction is one of the most important sectors, but it's also one of the most wasteful, and globally, the most considerable environmental impact that comes from the built environment sector comes as a result of losing these resources and materials at the end of their life, and the impact associated with the ongoing need for virgin resource extraction. So, looking at the opportunity to minimize the use of energy and the GHG emissions that come from the extraction and the transportation and manufacturing of materials, and looking at how to retain the value of some of those resources addresses that problem.
So you mentioned the word waste quite a bit, and I think I've seen in most things that I've seen written about the circular economy, it really has a focus on mitigating the waste that's out there. How large is the scope of this waste, and what does it entail?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. We typically think of waste in terms of the the stuff we dump into the landfill, or the materials that end up, as pollution in the environment. But in terms of a circular economy definition, waste actually sort of comes in four different forms. One is sort of the wasted resources that, that are happening if we're not able to continually regenerate those or capture the value out of those. Secondly, it's the sort of wasted or underutilized assets. So you think of, say, buildings that sit empty or underutilized half the time. Thirdly, there's sort of the wasted life cycle. So it's the premature end of use of buildings, given the lack of repair or maintenance, or their reuse and adaptability over time. And lastly, sort of the wasted embedded value. So how do we reclaim the materials components or the energy that's stored in some of these materials at the end of life through processes like deconstruction or material recovery. But so that's kind of the broadest sense of the definition of waste. But in terms of the impact in Canada, we are one of the largest consumers of raw materials, and the waste stream, there's close to 4 million tons of construction materials that are entering our landfill on an annual basis that come from the construction sector. And within those, there's a huge amount of embodied energy and carbon, for example. So we're essentially, contributing to the climate change issue by allowing all these materials to enter the landfill at the same time as not recapturing some of the economic value that comes out of them.
Is there an approximate percentage or a value on how much a circular economy could reduce or eliminate of that?
A good question as well. I don't know that the economics have really been done on that from a sector specific perspective. And in Canada, we're just starting to look at this in more detail and start to quantify some of the lost value. There has been work done by the National Zero Waste Council looking at different sectors and how some interventions can create new value and dollars. And certainly companies like Unbuilders in British Columbia, who are using deconstruction as a business model, are creating hundreds of jobs locally through sort of this opportunity. But I don't know that there's been a quantification of the actual dollar value lost for the construction sector, for example.
Okay, well, let's conclude our first segment in this two-part series by looking at barriers and enablers, because your recent report at Delphi really examined what some of these were. And let's talk first of all about the enablers of a circular economy and how you might itemize them principally.
Yeah, and I like to think of the enablers as sort of a response to some of the challenges or the barriers. But because as I mentioned earlier, it's about sort of rethinking the system to some degree and the way we've been doing things. A lot of the impact that happens, environmental impact and economic loss happens at the design stage. So really thinking about applying circular economy principles early on in, say, the product or a building's design. And that can include, principles like design for disassembly, or designing for durability, or designing for adaptability, so that, you've got products that can be refurbished, or buildings that can be, repaired and maintained and adapted over time, like we saw during the pandemic. A need for buildings to be adaptable to different uses, in office spaces, for example. So really embracing circularity in the design stage would be one key enabler. Secondly, there's a need for greater awareness and education across the whole value chain, from designers and architects to building officials and to others in the construction sector, to really embrace some of these practices, but also to better understand what the return on investment is for moving in the space, and what the different business models are that can create new value and new revenues. Thirdly, I'd say because we're thinking in systems approaches here, it can't be siloed. And so it's really important to think about it from a cross-sector collaboration perspective. And so looking at buildings, for example, that are working together with the architects and designers and developers early on with the construction players and the building material providers, so that you're actually thinking about it as a system as you're putting these buildings together in those early stages. And so there's processes like integrated design processes or project delivery models that allow for better cross-sector collaboration, which is really critical for this. I would say that there's opportunities for a lot more innovation. So supporting business model innovation, supporting process innovation, supply chain innovation, technology innovation, to improve, how we're using our materials and how we're, putting them together in buildings. And one example would be mass timber as a product that shows real potential. And then lastly, I would say the supportive policy space, so the incentives, the regulations, the standards, procurement as a key driver for demand for moving in this direction.
And so maybe I got it a bit backwards, and not leading with the negative stuff first, but let's conclude a bit with the negative stuff. And what are the barriers that you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, we're still set up in sort of this linear approach to how we function within the economy. I think there's evidence globally that shows that we're only about 9% circular globally, which means that the vast majority of the materials that we use end up lost at the end of their use. And even in Canada, they've done some analysis in Quebec, and it was actually closer to 3%. So we have to sort of think about what are the incentives and the enablers that allow us to transition away from this sort of linear status quo. And so there's cost challenges right now that exist in terms of moving away from the current system. So that's probably one of the biggest issues. I mentioned sort of the need to grow awareness, but the lack of awareness and the information, as well as even standardized definitions about what we're talking about, create certain barriers. I'd say the fragmentation across construction industries. We've got people that work sort of in their spaces, but they're not often communicating or collaborating to design in ways that or operate or build in ways that work together across the value chain. And we also have infrastructure gaps and supply chain issues. So, for example, I mentioned unbuilders earlier, but that's an example where a company has developed a business model to deconstruct older homes and reclaim the value of those old growth lumber in homes, for example. But right now there's nowhere to sort those or places to sort of store secondhand materials. So how do we get the infrastructure in place and the reverse logistics there to collect those materials and get them back into the market and help to build the business case there? So work to be done in that space.
Look, that's all extremely interesting, and but I think it's a good place for us to stop for this first segment. We have a good foundation of information, so we can take a look at the economic opportunities in our next segment. Thanks a lot, Paul, for your help to this point. We're going to take a break, and if you're watching the first part of our discussion on a Wednesday, part 2 runs tomorrow. If you're watching us later than that, part 2 can be found at bib.com. So join us for that. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief of Business in Vancouver. You've been watching BIB Today.